Happy Friday! With the release of the Goodreads Choice Awards winners, could I have been more wrong in the fantasy category? Technically, yes. Yes, I could have been. But if you want to see how wrong I was, go ahead and check out my video on the finalists for the Goodreads Choice Awards, because I truly believed in my heart of hearts that The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafi by Shannon Chakraborty would win, or at least rank very high in that category. And that may just be because of what I was seeing around me, what my friends were talking about and enjoying, because as I've mentioned before, my friend Emily also picked this book up with me on Indie Bookstore Day independently. It was on both of our lists and very much enjoyed it. And so I was reading this, one, because I wanted to get it read. I've been wanting to read it all year, and because I really believed it had a shot at winning that category. And spoiler alert, it didn't. And I probably was not a help there because I didn't get it finished in time. So I ultimately didn't even vote in the category because I was kind of conflicted. I was about halfway or more through when voting closed, and I could definitely tell it's what I wanted to vote for, but because I hadn't officially finished, I felt bad doing that. So my last official vote was for Starling House, which I also very much enjoyed. But this was just such a fun, classic fantasy adventure romp. And this isn't even the first lady pirate book we read this year. We also talked about Deep as the Sky, Red as the Sea earlier this year, which had some supernatural elements in terms of like superstitions and the superstitions of seafaring folk and pirates. But it was also much more political and very much more historical fiction, at least to my reading. And this is also political and historical fiction, but the magical element here is undeniable. And as a millennial that saw all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, the original ones, in theaters growing up, and remembers how kind of revolutionary the first one was to me in my kind of perception, with its mix of adventure and romance and the supernatural with humor and heart, I definitely think that this evokes very similar feelings. And while the structure of this is kind of apparent at times, it's in a way that is so incredibly comforting, and it feels like you are on the journey with these characters. And when I say this structure, it's because the heart of this is following Amina Al-Sirafi. I know, shocker based on the title, as she is being pulled out of retirement into a new adventure. She's a pirate or a privateer of some renown in the Indian Ocean. We get this beautiful map, which is incredibly helpful because this book takes place in the 12th century, and so the kind of map has changed significantly since then, and the way countries are referred to is much different than they may be referred to today, or I am just geographically challenged and I need a map. So it's also incredibly beautiful and I appreciate it. We've got our little moon up here. Spoiler alert, the moon is important. Of course, the moon is important for sailors regardless, but if you've read the book, you know. So when we meet her, she is about a decade in to retirement with her young daughter and is just kind of trying to provide for her family and isn't the most financially stable in that. And so when this rich older woman appears and offers her this great bounty to do a job for her, she initially balks because she is out of that life, but the reward offered is ultimately too great, and this woman has a connection to one of her old crewmates and someone that had an end that Amina feels responsible for. So we're dropped narratively at a beginning, but also because she is retired, there is all of this backstory and the sense that we are also in the middle of a story, and that works so incredibly well and is part of the scaffolding that I can see that I mentioned, but in a way that you really appreciate what is going on, because it's also just not where we have been narratively thrown in, because we are going to go through the motions of getting the gang back together, and that is a large portion of the book, but the like small adventures on the way. But then we also have this framing device of Amina telling this story to someone, to our ultimate narrator, and there are some breaks in the narrative where they are directly addressing each other, and that kind of adds to the humor of everything. There's a real lightness to this voice amidst even like the supernatural heaviness, the kind of political heaviness, the human nature pondering heaviness that we have here is really balanced out so well with this great adventurous spirit, but also this real humor. And the way that everything is framed also leaves this question dangling, because we get the sense that there is more to be known about this narrative narrator, Jamal, than we know at the beginning of the book, but we don't ultimately know if he is going to intersect with the story or if him being that kind of narrative voice is his intersection with the story altogether. But either way, that adds a great levity and tone to everything. I really do enjoy those breaks. They don't feel distracting to me. Rather, it feels like a way to kind of temper things. So Amina goes off on this quest to track down this lost daughter of her old crewmate, essentially, who, according to the girl's grandmother, has been kidnapped by a Frank, but that truth gets complicated as Amina digs into what is really going on. And in the midst of all of this, she collects her former crew members, her poisoner, her first mate, and her navigator. And despite the closeness that is evident with these people, the histories that are evident and help really kind of give a depth to the narrative, because it is a kind of getting the crew back together story at the heart of it, and yet it has all of these extra layers. We're wanting to know what these revelations in these histories are, even as we know that that revelation is kind of being dangled in front of us as a way to keep the forward momentum of the narrative going. It is satisfying in that chase, at least it was for me. And so despite these evident histories, there is also this estrangement that has happened over the last decade that really ties back to Amina's guilt related to the ending of one of their other crew members. And this also feels tied into the fact that Amina has been hiding her daughter essentially from her father. And there is this sense in the way Amina relays her tales that she has had many husbands in the past, partly because based on her religion, they have to be married to enjoy marital acts. But there is a much more complicated history to the beginning and ending of her relationship with her daughter's father, who does come back into the picture. And as expected, there is much more to him than meets the eye. He is not a jinn, as Amina describes him, but is a demon or a lesser trickster god of sorts that feeds off of the ambitions of others. And Amina's ambitions are so big, and her potential for what stories can be told about her and the legend she can and presumably will be based on the way these stories are framed is so big. And so that really is a draw for him. However, she does not want him knowing about this daughter. And this is kind of juxtaposed against her quest to chase after the daughter of this former crewmate who has joined forces, or at least kind of gone after this Frank who is interested in the occult because she is interested in her own family history and thinks she has knowledge, but doesn't realize just how dangerous this man is and how he wants to unleash this kind of chaos in pursuit of his own power. And I think Falco as an antagonist, this Frank that is obsessed with the occult and power, is such a smart move. It's a kind of twist and inversion of a lot of stereotypes of Middle Eastern antagonists, and it's also this kind of interrogation of politics and power that is happening at the time, especially as this novel, at least in its kind of asides and Amina's thoughts, directly engages with the idea of the Crusades and the politics behind the Crusades. And while religion is very central to the story in the way that it guides and informs the characters, I really appreciate how it unpacks a lot of this historical nuance through a lens that is a little bit more pulled back from that and looks at kind of the politics of it and the pursuit of power and religion being used in that pursuit of power and what that begets, and instead frames religion very personally. And we also have, by nature of the fact of this pirate ship and this idea that sailors and pirates at this time were a much more eclectic group, something that is emphasized throughout the narrative. We have a very diverse group of people in relation to the religions they practice and how that shapes their worldview, but more importantly, how they exist together and respect those different worldviews and still are chasing after the same goals and have this found family in spite of that. I really loved seeing the respect there combined with the character work. And so Amina is on this journey that pulls her and those closest to her further into danger and puts them closer to the supernatural and these larger powers, even as her main goal, as she states it throughout the book, is to get home to her daughter. And this is also the second pirate tale we've talked about this year that really interrogates the idea of motherhood and being a pirate leader. And we know based on the narrative that Amina has renown behind her and also has renown in front of her. Her legend is just at its start as this narrative begins, even if she is sought out based on her legend at the beginning of the narrative, if that makes sense. So there is so much growth yet to come. And so there's this kind of tension between the family life that she has returned to for the last decade and the family she has on the sea and her ambitions there and how at home she feels on the sea and the power it gives her. And this is further kind of emphasized by her formerly estranged husband, really playing into the building up of that legend around her and all that she can be, and more importantly, all of the ambition she has for herself. And so it's really playing with this idea of motherhood and how we remain ourselves within motherhood, and this idea that we can still have these separate identities and these separate ambitions from motherhood while still loving and cherishing everything related to motherhood, that they're not mutually exclusive, and that you don't have to give up all of yourself in pursuit of motherhood, and yet it never shies away from the danger she is in and how that raises the stakes for her and also complicates her identity as a mother for herself in a lot of ways. And so I really love, obviously, having this strong central heroine, and a heroine who still has her flaws, but those flaws make things more interesting, and I think that's part of the humor of the book too. It acknowledges the flaws, it acknowledges the pitfalls, and finds the humor in them and twists them, and the flaws are what make the characters so interesting. It's what creates this really interesting ensemble that is so imperative to this book, but Amina is such a strong center to that, and I really appreciate that, especially because by my estimate, it mentions her being middle-aged. I read her as like in her mid to late 40s probably, so I really enjoyed following an older woman by fantasy adventure standards, and this idea that she has been through so many iterations of herself, and we are seeing this new iteration, and also most importantly, I think, this fact that she is only beginning to step into her legend and her power at this age. And so life does not end after motherhood, and that we still have all of this ahead of us. I also admittedly loved the verbal sparring with sexual tension between her and her estranged demon husband, Raksh. While there's not any payoff to romance in this novel, and it's not set up for us to believe that that is where things are going, there is also the potential there, I think, in the sense that we have these very flawed characters. Raksh is a very flawed character. I'm not rooting for a romance in its current form, but he's also such an interesting character, and I think that there is so much opportunity to watch that character arc develop over the course of this presumed trilogy, at least as currently listed. And so I'm really, really interested to see where that character development is going to go. And if that character development offers up opportunities for shipping, who am I to deny myself? But I also really like that we aren't rushing anything. That is not the focus. The characters really are the focus, which helps make the iterations of them more interesting. And I think that the ensemble nature of things, as we're kind of gathering up former crew members and learning about the histories and things are kind of slowly unraveling, I think that that helps add the opportunity for levity while still having this really dangerous supernatural antagonist. Now, some of the supernatural twists did take my suspension of disbelief a little bit. There is an island. There are multiple islands, so I'm not even really spoiling anything there. But there is an island at one point in this book where I do have to kind of suspend my disbelief a little bit, but it's also that exploration of liminal spaces in a new way. Although the sea itself is a liminal space, listen, we know I love a liminal space. I do greatly appreciate circling back to both this idea of the sea as a liminal space, but also the exploration of like the politics and power struggles within the world of the book, and how Amina exists outside of that while on the ocean, and how we see the varying degrees of power she wields as a woman, and how that changes based on her circumstances, whether that be where she is geographically, who is around her, what power she holds, or the kind of economic realities and how class plays into things, because class is definitely explored here. And it also explores some of the more violent realities without feeling like it is exploiting them. For instance, Amina is threatened physically by the antagonist at one point, and he basically threatens to have his people assault her from the moment he feels like things aren't going his way. And so it really examines how quickly that is a power play made against women, and really having that emphasized when it's lobbed against Amina, who is older and stronger and has this reputation behind her, and that's still the first place a man goes against her when something is not going their way. And so it's all these like little moments, and all these little moments and action is further underscored by the prose of the book. I highlighted so many passages in this book. Full disclosure, I highlighted them on my Kobo because this book went on sale for a couple dollars months ago, and I bought it so that I didn't always have to hold the book, because sometimes I want to read in bed and be a lazy piece of poo. So we would have these kind of reflective or insightful moments, and they were saved from being like fully didactic because one, we were kind of going on the journey of Amina kind of puzzling through those thoughts herself. Second, it was usually tempered or underscored by action, so it didn't necessarily just feel preachy out of nowhere. And because we had that nice humor to balance things out as well, so we had a really balanced narrative that allowed us to get deep in places because it was also irreverent in places. And in addition to that accessible prose, the pacing of the book is just so well done. Like I mentioned, we spent a good portion of the book kind of gathering these former crewmates, and there were times where I was just so along for the ride, I kind of lost track of narratively where we were going, and there were times where I was like, wait, are we gonna have time to kind of wrap up this magical antagonist element of things, or is this going to carry out over the course of the next books? And the next books are definitely set up, but we do have a very satisfying conclusion to the central conflict in this book, even as we don't feel like we are rushing to anything. I think part of the way this is handled is in its narrative structure. We have this voice that keeps everything moving, that has these little elements of humor to it to keep everything feeling very fast-paced, as well as the fast-paced action of it. The action is very economical. I'm someone who notoriously will get lost in an action sequence, and I never feel like anything is really overdone here. Everything really does feel like it's serving the plot or the characters in the moment of the action. And we have enough cuts in the action with these kind of narrative asides between Amina and Jamal, which aren't all just jokes about what may be in certain libraries, but dangle kind of narrative treasures for us. We know we are still chasing something specific. And that offered a kind of reassurance for me as well that the narrative would reach a satisfying conclusion. And so there was enough of that framing structure that I mentioned being evident earlier to give me the support and the reassurance that I could go along for the ride and kind of get lost in everything else because I knew that that framework was there. And structurally and narratively, it both felt familiar and comforting and new and exciting. And so it struck such a nice balance in so many things. And I think it was just masterfully constructed. And I also really appreciated the structure and the kind of parallels and the full circle kind of nature of everything in this book in a way that I'm incredibly interested to see how that is going to be handled in subsequent books and what some of those twists and turns and kind of revelations are going to be in the upcoming narratives. So very excited to continue to go on these journeys with Amina and the rest of her crew. Now, this is, like I said, a very ensemble-based kind of book, so to fully enjoy it, I do think that you have to be kind of on board for the ensemble and the kind of hijinks of it in some way. The plot is there and I think constructed well, but sometimes falls a little bit to the background in some cases, at least to my reading. But I would be so interested to hear what you thought of this book if you've read it. If you were thinking of reading it, I would highly encourage you to jump in, and I have now even further reason to read those unread copies of the Devabad trilogy that have been sitting on my shelf since like 2020. I think I bought the last book. I bought the last book when it came out, and I haven't read any of them yet, even though I wanted to. So if you think I need to read that, also let me know. But as always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. It really does help me out. But most importantly, read something good. And yeah, bye.